So here's the thing about war. No country enters one without the desire to dominate the other side and win. But in order to do so, there are often some pretty strict rules that the soldiers fighting in the trenches have to follow. But did you know that during World War II, one country outlawed dancing? Yeah, me neither. Stick around to find out who it was, because today we're looking at some of the strangest rules soldiers during World War II had to follow. "We shall never surrender." That's one of Winston Churchill's most famous quotes, and one of my worst impressions. But yeah, he's got nothing on the Japanese. You see, imperial leaders took it a step further and added in a fight to the death or keep fighting. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. Some of these Japanese servicemen refused to surrender for years or even decades after the empire's surrender. Among the most notable of the holdouts to return to Japan was Shoichi Yokoi. He was the last of nearly 5,000 Japanese fighters who had refused to surrender after Guam fell to the US forces. Yokoi hid out until 1972 when he was found by local fishermen. He apologized publicly to the emperor upon his return. 2 years later, Hiro Onoda was discovered on Lubang, refusing to be repatriated until his commanding officer arrived and directly ordered him to do so.
As an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I had to follow my orders, as I was a soldier.
The last confirmed soldier was a Taiwanese native fighting for the Japanese. He was found in December 1974. As recently as 2005, two elderly men emerged in the Philippines claiming to be holdouts, though their claims have been met with tons of skepticism. So we know all about those Japanese holdouts and fight to the death, but this wasn't an issue exclusive to the imperial forces. Most leaders decreed to keep fighting, and whatever you do, don't retreat or run for it without orders. The Soviet Union took an especially dim view of desertion. During the German onslaught, Stalin issued his anti-desertion Order 270, which stated that even when surrounded, Soviet units were to fight to the death rather than surrender, or be shot if they didn't resist hard enough. Even their families back home could be subject to punishment. Though some Soviet deserters were shot, it was deemed counterproductive to shoot too many. The most common fate was to be sent back to the front, either in one's own unit or a special penal unit assigned dangerous work. And if you think that the good old US of A was above that kind of order, well, that's a no. The US executed one soldier for desertion during the war. His name was Private Eddie Slovik. Slovik deserted in the autumn of 1944. He returned and was warned not to disappear again, but then he deserted a second time. General Eisenhower wanted to make an example out of him, and he was executed by firing squad in January 1945. He remains the only US serviceman to be executed for desertion since 1864. The Winter War is this kind of forgotten part of World War II. That's when the Soviets invaded Finland. Now, the Finns fought like the Dickens and gave Russia all they had. Given all this stress, it's easy to imagine a Finnish fighter wanting to spend his time on leave unwinding. But one thing was forbidden: dancing. Yes, public dances for both civilians and for soldiers on leave were banned in Finland, twice. First during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and then during the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944. People flouted the ban as time wore on. After all, nearly 5 years without busting a move was a lot to ask. But dancers were raided, and a number of people were punished, who were even killed in these dance hall raids. After the Continuation War with the Soviets concluded in 1944, Finns had to put up with shortages, the loss of one of their provinces, and retreating Germans. But at least they could again distract themselves with dancing. You probably know that General George Patton was one of the United States' most effective commanders of World War II. But what you may not know was that he was a snappy dresser. This urge to dress well influenced his standards for troops under his command, who had to wear neckties in battle, even in hot, sticky Sicily. Reportedly, the only way out of the necktie decree was to present a doctor's note, as one soldier who had survived having his throat cut by a German soldier did. The options? I'd probably just suck it up and wear the necktie. As Allied soldiers approached the university city of Bonn in Western Germany, the Germans tried to destroy records implicating them in their nation's crimes. But a quick-thinking Polish lab technician salvaged the dossier of German and Austrian scientists. This information was used to make a list for one of the most grim scavenger hunts in modern history. America wanted to benefit from these scientific minds nearly as much as they wanted to prevent the Soviets from doing so. So Operation Paperclip, a program to snag and use these experts, was born. Armed with this list, American soldiers capturing Nazi forces were on the lookout for these VIPs, with whom the US might be willing to cut a deal, offering them amnesty and a new life in the US in exchange for their scientific know-how. Individual soldiers sometimes made the collars. Werner von Braun, a brilliant rocket scientist later key to the US space program, surrendered to a private monitoring a rural road in Austria.
Now here's a model of my design for a 4-stage orbital rocket ship.
Cleanliness is next to godliness. And uncleanliness? Well, that's the Oregon Trail. Typhus, a bacterial disease spread by lice, was so feared by German administrators that enterprising Polish doctors faked an outbreak to keep workers from being deported to Germany for forced labor. Dysentery, our old friend, has plagued armies for centuries. Hand washing, general cleanliness, hot showers, and aggressive laundering went a long way toward limiting the spread of conditions like these. In addition to straightforward personal hygiene, maintaining a sanitary environment was also emphasized in wartime messaging. Cleaning latrines, covering trash, and managing insect populations were simple actions enlisted soldiers could take that limited the spread of disease and kept more men in fighting shape.
Dirt and filth are the brothers of discomfort, disease, and death.
So, obviously, secrecy is key during wartime, and both the Axis and Allied armies worked hard to conceal their plans, which included making sure soldiers kept their mouths shut. Starting in March 1940, Nazi censors began monitoring mail going to, from, and between German soldiers. Among various other restrictions, soldiers were to write only in European languages, which explicitly excluded Morse code, refrain from giving details of Axis or Allied movements or attacks, and send no pictures of important military installations. The Allies also censored mail, and with similar aims in mind. And self-censorship was also an important factor. Public information campaigns taught both soldiers and people on the home front of the dangers of loose lips. Both Axis and Allied forces used scorched earth approaches during the war, with one of the most striking examples coming in the early stages of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Soviet units smashed roads and bridges, disabled the railroad, destroyed food stores, and in some cases broke down entire factories and sent them further east for reassembly. The Soviets also evacuated more than 17 million of their citizens from the combat zone, denying the Germans this colossal pool of labor, preserving it for their own war effort. Nazis notoriously left ruins behind when they retreated, but thankfully, one of the worst proposed scorched earth attacks never came to pass. Faced with the imminent liberation of Paris, Hitler ordered the French capital destroyed. A horrified General Dietrich von Koltitz refused to follow orders, instead stalling until the Allies retook the city of lights. After the war ended, the victorious Allies were left to handle those who had carried out the Axis powers' crimes against humanity. Key Nazis were taken to Nuremberg to face trial. There, a number of defendants presented the defense that they had just been following orders, and thus could not be personally held responsible for what happened. And conveniently for them, the ultimate source of those orders, Adolf Hitler, was dead. The judges, drawn from the victorious major Allied states of France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, rejected this defense. They wrote in a decision that created an important legal precedent that the soldiers who had committed atrocities knew, or at least should have known, that what they were doing was wrong. While it might have been dangerous for them to disobey these orders, they were not at immediate risk of death for doing so. Nuremberg established the right of the world to hold such wrongdoers accountable.
Humanity has waited for this moment of retribution, when the insane ambitions of men like these would come up against the stone wall of world justice.
Here's the interesting thing. It actually sort of circles back to the first thing we discussed, Japanese soldiers that kept on fighting. In a sense, legally speaking, soldiers should know when to stop and when to surrender, regardless of orders from superiors. Now, we tend to gloss over Italy when it comes to World War II, but they were fascist way before Germany ever was. Of course, Italy's gung-ho approach to an all-fascist Europe cracked in 1943. Several factors, perhaps most importantly the Allied invasion of Italy in September of that year, effectively obliterated the Italian will to continue the war. In late July, the seldom relevant King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini. The caretaker government took control. Sort of. They were too inept to even give the military orders to defend Rome, and Germany soon overran northern and central Italy. Allied commanders correctly assumed that Italy's wartime struggles would turn most Italians, including those in the armed forces, against Germany. In October 1943, barely a month after the Allied invasion, Italy officially switched sides and joined the Allies. In under a year, Italian soldiers had gone from Germany's staunchest ally to their sworn enemy. It also marked the second straight world war where Italy switched sides. Got that going. France and Poland, Germany's largest and strongest neighbors, both came under foreign occupation relatively early in the war. But while both nations were defeated, their battered armies weren't completely destroyed, and those that survived continued to fight for the rest of the war. Using bases in the United Kingdom and personnel and resources from across France's colonial empire in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the French General Charles de Gaulle cobbled together an effective fighting force. These Free French fighters coordinated with their allies in the resistance and occupied France, while also fighting alongside British troops in Africa and Italy. eventually participating in the liberation of France itself. Poland had a much wilder ride. They were initially invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union, prior to the Soviets switching sides and joining the Allied cause. While some Polish soldiers evacuated to France and the United Kingdom and participated in the war efforts there, others were captured by the Soviet Union. So when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets recruited a captured Polish general to lead an army of Polish prisoners against the Germans. These freed soldiers trained in Iran of all places, where they joined up with British forces who were occupying parts of Iran to keep its oil out of Axis hands. And we're not talking about a few troops here and there. Somewhere around 33,000 Polish soldiers ended up in Iran. They didn't have that on your